This is Dina Marie, host of The Voice of the Shepherd, with a morning blend Franciscan moment on Mater Dei Radio. What kind of danger lies in our mission to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ? Upon a careful study of the lives of the saints, we quickly realize that proclaiming the truth of Jesus Christ and being living witnesses of our Christian faith is not necessarily welcome in every culture, government, or nation. There is a price to pay for standing firm in the truth, and this reality is made clear by the words of many of Christ's earliest followers, the early apostles, St. Paul, and of course, the first Christian martyrs. On January 16th, the Franciscans honor 5 Franciscan saints known as the Protomartyrs of the Franciscan Order. With me today to reflect upon their story and their zeal to be missionaries for Christ is Franciscan Friar Father Dan Pattee. Father Dan, welcome back to the program. Happy New Year as we gather into this month of January.
Well, thank you, Dina Marie. Happy New Year. As we close down that 2022, we enter into a whole new set of days, and grateful to be here to start it off with the Protomartyrs of Franciscans.
Well, this is an interesting part of the history of the Franciscan Order, and I think probably some saints and martyrs that we're not familiar with, these proto-martyrs. So give us a sense of, they died on January 16th. We know the year 1220. What's going on in the church? What's going on with St. Francis and his friars in this time of history?
Well, of course, one of the things that has already begun going back to the 11th century is the whole tradition of the Crusades. You have the Christian armies in the Middle East attempting to liberate the Holy Lands, the holy sites, for pilgrims from the Christian world to go down and visit places where Jesus was born, where he was crucified, and the like. And of course, part of that would include the services and the church coming in place and attempting to preach to the Muslims as well to convert them. And that was one of the ways that they also went at it. It wasn't just by sword, but it was also by the word of God, that you had preachers going down. And of course, Francis has this new order. It's been around now for about 7 years. It's young. And he decides it's time to send some missionaries down there to try to preach and convert some of the Muslims. And that's what he does. At the chapter of 1219, Francis commissioned these 6 men to head to Spain, and from there to go into the land of Morocco to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Wow. And, from some of the accounts that I've read, Father Dan, these men were passionate, as was St. Francis, of this opportunity to convert souls for Christ. I mean, this is their mission. What do we know about their encounter? Because 6 went, but one of their leader got sick, wasn't able to continue with the trip.
Right, yeah, they got to Spain, and of course, by the time they got to Spain, one of them did get deathly ill, and he was the leader of the group. And so he told them, "You're going to have to go without me," and he put Berard at the head of the community. And so Berard took them from there and headed south into Spain on their way to Morocco, and parts of that were already occupied by the Muslims, and they already started right there to preach the gospel as well. But the other thing, as a side note, that's interesting here, Francis wasn't one to just send others. In 1219, he also left to go to Damietta to preach to the Sultan at the same time. So you have Francis heading south, you've got these friars heading south, and they're going. And so this really was something of a movement that came out of the chapter of 1219, which is, we got to preach the gospel to the Muslims.
Wow. What do we know about their encounters, Father Dan, as they come? Because this is a very hostile, particularly if you're told that you're not following the right religion. This this is in dangerous territory.
Oh, it was, yeah, and in Muslim territories, to name the name Jesus Christ, merited for you death. And so that's what they first encountered. When they first preached the gospel in southern Spain, what happened was when they began to preach the gospel, they found resistance, as they expected, for naming the name Jesus Christ. And the leader of the town was going to have them beheaded until his son prevailed upon them and said, just let them go, and he did. And so they didn't fold up their tents and head north to go back to Italy. Well, we tried. No, they went on to Morocco to do it there, since they couldn't, they were unsuccessful in this particular portion of southern Spain. So they got on a boat and crossed over and went over to Morocco and tried to preach the gospel.
It just amazes me. We're talking with Father Dan about the Protomartyrs of the Franciscan Order, their feast day celebrated on January 16th. This goes back to the year 1220. And we think about the early Christians, the early brothers and sisters who wanted to stand firm and continue to stand firm in the faith and proclaiming the truth, even in the midst of danger and potentially peril. Now, you mentioned St. Francis, and we know the story of Francis. Now, he left with his life when he encountered the Sultan, and yet we're celebrating a feast of martyrs.
Right, yeah. And of course, we have an eyewitness at the Christian line of what Francis did. He basically stood up from the Christian line and said, I'm a Christian, take me to your leader. And of course, they arrested him and brought him to Al-Kamil, who was the Sultan at the time. But Francis himself was not called to martyrdom the way the other five were. We don't choose to make ourselves martyrs. Testimony is given by God, or as Jesus says, I don't need human testimony. It's useless. But when you give testimony that's divine, this is what these martyrs do. That's what martyr means. It means to witness to the truth. And that's what they did to the death. And that was something Francis wasn't called to. But it's interesting, when he heard about the death of Berard and his companions, he's reported to have said, now I know I have at least 5 true friar minors. And I'm sure he felt disappointed that he couldn't have been among them, because he really tried. And he named Jesus right there in front of the Sultan. And instead of having the Sultan and all his armies come against him, they befriended him instead and gave him an armed escort back to the Christian line so no one would hurt him. It's like, well, that was the last thing he wanted to have happen. But Berard and his companions, on the other hand, when they preached the name, they eventually did meet up with some very the Chronicle of the 24 Generals gives a pretty detailed account of what happened. They were, for example, scourged. And of course, once you're scourged, you have open wounds on your body. And then they had like boiling oil poured into their open wounds and things like this prior to the Muslim leader in Morocco taking a sword and just hacking them on the brain, right on the forehead, and apparently he went through, according to the Chronicle, 3 swords to get the job done with these 5, so it was a pretty brutal death that they suffered.
Wow. Talking with Father Dan Pattee about the Protomartyrs, the first 5 Protomartyrs in the Franciscan Order. And we have a special feast day just for them. Particularly the Franciscans celebrate this on January 16th. And Father Dan, I've got more questions to ask you. And I want to talk a little bit about what happened after these men were martyred and how that influenced the Franciscan Order. But I am coming up on a break. Stay with me, and then we can continue our conversation in the next half hour.
Sounds good. Thank you.